Hi, my name is Erin Elliott, and I'm the Senior Director of Alumni Engagement for the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. Thank you for tuning in to this faculty mini-college recording session highlighting U of M faculty from different schools and colleges talking about their research. Every year, the university holds two mini-college events in Naples, Florida, and in Phoenix, Arizona. Mini-college is a half-day, lifelong learning opportunity that features presentations from faculty around the U. Mini-college is a partnership with the University of Schools and Colleges, the Alumni Association, and the U of M Foundation. Ty Mendenhall presented at the Florida Mini-College this year. It is my pleasure to welcome Ty Mendenhall to present Responding to Trauma, Advancing Psychological First Aid to Patients and Families in Crisis. Ty is an associate professor in the medical family therapist at the University of Minnesota and the Department of Family Social Science and adjunct faculty member of the University of Minnesota's Department of Family Medicine and Community Health. He is the co-founder and clinical director of his University Medical Reserve Corps Mental Health Crisis Response Team and works actively in the coordination and conduct of team trainings across the Midwest through the university's Schools of Public Health and the Minnesota Department of Health. Dr. Mendenhall has also worked actively in the field across a variety of small and large-scale deployments, including local shootings, neighborhood and workplace deaths, and the September 11th terrorist attacks, the 35W bridge collapse, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, the East African tsunami, and weather events, examples of tornadoes, floodings. He has published in multiple referred journals regarding the conduct of interdisciplinary trauma and the disaster response teams and presents regularly across local, national, and international forums regarding these efforts. Ty, thanks so much for being here today.
Well, I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
All right, we'll get to your slides here. Wonderful.
All right, well, again, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about this work. At the University of Minnesota proper, I wear a couple of different hats, and today I'm going to be talking about our work in the Responding to Trauma. That is a partnership between a number of different places and departments at the university, housed by the Academic Health Center, and intersecting with the Department of Family Social Science, the Department of Family Medicine, School of Public Health, etc. When we talk about trauma response teams, I think that intersection of a variety of different places at the university makes sense because trauma teams are interdisciplinary by design. We have just about every physical health and mental health discipline that you could imagine that are involved in these teams, alongside other disciplines and other fields that maybe you wouldn't in an intuitive sense think would be involved, but that they are there. I mean, logistics, a variety of engineering, and then a variety of smaller or subspecialties within public health, etc., that aren't necessarily involved in patient care, but are definitely involved in these teams. And then alongside that are professional collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration that we tell all of our students to do, all of our colleagues, different refereed journals that we talk about as being really the better way to do work. Trauma work also involves, on purpose, collaboration between professionals and lay community members. And I think that that's really important because otherwise, well, first of all, I mean, if we don't, then we go in like heroes, that we are coming in and doing good work, and I think that we are in a lot of regards, but at some point the professional presence or the rebuilding that is driven by a variety of different outside organizations does wane or transition to other things, and the longer term rebuilding that these communities do can take years after. And I think that from the very first day that trauma response happens, collaborating with local organizations, school teachers, school principals, church or other organizational leaders, county representatives, etc., is very important. So just because we are connected with the university and our care providers, and that's again the context or the lens that I'm looking at, doesn't mean that by any stretch of the imagination that we're doing all of the work. We're mobilized in, as my introduction said, in response to large and small-scale disasters, and those can be man-made or human-caused and natural. And the differentiation of these types of responses is important in a lot of regards, circling back to the training of the people that are going to be on the front lines. If you look at mental health professions, for example, most of the education and the experiences that are required of learners en route to ultimately licensure and being able to practice their field is set up for relatively structured type of care environments where patients or families come to you. You as the expert then do some kind of assessment, and then in imparting of your professional wisdom or expertise to somehow fix them in a relatively top-down, again, provider-driven type of manner, and oftentimes with a presumption of continuity of care, that you're going to see them, every week at 3 o'clock on Wednesday, or that they're going to check in, every quarter or something like that. The content that people present with in the context of crisis and disaster is very different than the content that we usually are trained in. And the process of care, where people are coming to you, for example, at a clinic, is not the process of care that's happening in the context of trauma. And I think that those things are important to think about, because just because you have a license, a licensed psychologist or a licensed family therapist or a licensed clinical specialist in social work, medical degree, medical license, does not mean that you're prepared to do trauma work by any stretch. And that's why specialized training is requisite. We do that through the MRC, Medical Reserve Corps, Red Cross, Green Cross, which is a specialized group mostly rallying around mental health in response to crisis, the ICISF, FEMA, and a variety of other local community-led organizations will do training as it relates to psychological first aid, as it relates to a variety of other types of or specialized versions of that, for example, with elderly or with children, with other vulnerable populations. And it's important because, again, that baseline training for a baseline license is generally pretty poorly equipped for trauma work. People always ask us then, what does this look like? They either get interested because they're exposed to a professional presentation about it, or hallway conversations about different colleagues of mine or myself that are involved in a deployment, and they want to know whether or not this is something that they would be interested in participating in too, and or whether they want to confirm that this is not something that they would want to do. I think that's an important insight as well, and it's a difficult question to answer, though, and I always liken it to my experience as a faculty member wearing one of my other hats as a teacher. I do a class called Intimate Relationships here at the University of Minnesota. It's an undergraduate class. Love the course, and students will oftentimes ask me, they're like, Dr. Ty, will you define love? Will you define intimacy? What is it? And my answer is oh my God, no. I don't want to define love. I think in a lot of regards to define it would be to limit it somehow, because it's bigger than that, whatever that is. I mean, how can you take something that is as amazing as love, or as potentially joyful or even painful as love, and define it? And I think that we can get into a variety of trouble when we try to define something that really in a lot of regards shouldn't be defined. And defining or describing trauma work is similar to that, because I can't. And my response oftentimes to people that want to know or understand really what getting involved in this work is like is to get involved in it, because the experience that once you're there is going to be different than anything that I can tell you. Now, in an artificial sense, I'm going to try, and we always do this in the writing and the presentations that we do, but understand that it really is going to be less than what it really is once you're there. Okay, human-caused disasters. qualitatively different oftentimes than natural disasters because of the ways that people try ultimately to make sense of what has happened. For example, most people align somehow with a sense of spirituality or religion, broadly defined. Some people are very front and center with that throughout their daily lives, and others become that way in the context of stress or disaster. But most folks have some kind of sense of higher power or higher order, and will oftentimes go there in response to natural disasters, that this hurricane or this tornado was maybe an act of God. That is very difficult to do in response to human-caused disasters. That, this school shooting, that somebody that murdered my little girl, this was somehow part of a larger plan by God, or that the all-knowing or all-loving God that I grew up with in Sunday school, if he or she is really all-knowing or all-loving, why did they allow this to happen? They saw it coming. They had to have known it was coming, and they certainly had the ability to stop it. Why did they not stop it? These are important to think about in context of sitting with people and working in disaster response to have a real sensitivity to the type of disaster that you're responding to. And as it relates to human-caused disasters, I think that that's the first place that we'll see it. I think also, and just in my own experience, the very first disaster I ever responded to outside of textbooks was September 11th. And I think that all of us that are listening to this presentation that I'm doing right now, when we see this image, are going to remember immediately where we were on this day. What we were doing that day, and then maybe that we stopped doing, what we did instead, who we were with, the conversations that we were having, the thoughts that we were having, the feelings that we were feeling of fear, maybe of anger, of helplessness. And I think that you didn't need to be in New York to feel traumatized on September 11th. And as it related to oftentimes those emotions of feeling helpless, of feeling anger, and something that was human-caused, the wisdom of disconnecting from media and remaining in a place of openness to the folks that we ultimately would respond to was essential, because meaning was happening on the news, meaning was happening with the talking heads that were trying to, like we all were, individually or collectively, in couples or in families or in communities, make sense of this. And we have to understand, though, that the experience of folks that we connect with in the context of trauma is oftentimes very different than media presents it. And we were told in our early training with this is that as soon as something happens is to turn the TV off. And this image, this iconic image that so many of us associate with and can go right back, no matter how many years pass, to all of those memories like they just happened yesterday, was simply not an image that folks that were immediately impacted by 9/11 saw. I mean, this was taken out of a helicopter, or there's others that are similar that were taken out of nearby buildings. Nobody that was in the towers, nobody that was close to the towers literally had the ability to have a perspective like this. And one of the things that was very impactful for me, and again, this was my very first deployment, was that if it was a young person or if it was an old person, ethnicity, gender didn't matter. I mean, one of the most common things that we were hearing was not the experiences of an airplane flying into a building or smoke or explosions, but the sound that bodies made when they would land on the concrete. That was outside of anybody's experience. I mean, all of us have seen explosions. We've heard them. I mean, just turn on, cable. But the sound of bodies landing on concrete, that's not something that most of us have heard. And being able to sit with and to hear and to be open with that, I think, can get missed when we go into different contexts and we already kind of presume what we're going to hear. And I think that disconnecting from media, from our trauma response teams, is essential so that we don't do that. When we're on these deployments, and I was on 2 different deployments with 9/11, every one of our team members had asthmatic symptoms. Even weeks after the event, it was very unsafe to be there. There was a palpable sadness in the air, and I don't know how else to describe it. That really wasn't very New York-like. You know, in a city that's always on the move, that's always kind of go, 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 and kind of, you know, everybody has the kind of stereotypes or ideas about what, like, the New Yorker, you know, kind of attitude, image, persona is. That was not there. And those of us who have cats and dogs, for example, have oftentimes experienced, if we're having a really bad day, or if we're really sad, or we're really stressed out, that our cat or our dog will be more cuddly with us. They'll be more snuggly. Maybe if they're always kind of wiggle worms when we pick them up, maybe they'll hold still. And we wonder, how can they, you know, intuit or respond that we're sad or that we're having a bad day? And the answer is actually connected to pheromones. Humans don't have a very good sense of smell, but animals certainly, many animals have better senses of smell than we do, and they can pick that up really from our perspiration, our hormones, or different ways that we're emitting that. And it's the only way that a lot of people have been able to explain this, is that there was this palpable sadness that was in the air, just like you or I could walk into the room and the couple, you know, maybe our friends or our roommates or our, you know, parents even, are acting happy, but we know that something's wrong. It's connected to pheromones, and it was like there was this sadness in the air, and I don't know how else to describe it, but everybody talked about it. All of our team members talked about it. People that resided in New York were talking about it. It's like, why does this just feel so icky? Why is this just so sad? And Bibles, candles, you know, notes, pictures that would normally get walked over or walked through, people were just walking slowly around. They would stop, they would look at them, they would read them. This is an image of St. Vincent's Hospital, where not very many people came, I mean, from the disaster site, because most people either walked away or they were vaporized. And there were, you know, hundreds, thousands of people that were waiting for word on loved ones. And if you walked all the way around the hospital, as far up as you could reach, there were pictures. And instead of just walking by, like maybe they would have on September 10th, people would stop and they would read them and they would look at them. Here in Minnesota, I think for a lot of my students and colleagues, and myself too, honestly, I think that there's this automatic kind of thinking or unconscious thinking that disaster or trauma always happens somewhere else, and you go to it. And when our bridge fell, we as team members here through the Academic Health Center and the University of Minnesota were dealing with something that a lot of our New York colleagues were back at 9/11, and that was, how do you do this job in trauma response at the same time that you arguably are traumatized? You know, because all of us had driven across the bridge, you know, at least once and sometimes daily, and maybe even that morning, and then we're having to pull it together and to be in that role at the same time. You know, again, that we are feeling many of the same emotions that the very people that we're, you know, extending our help and our services to are feeling. And that was a whole nother overlay in terms of the work and the preparation that we did with students and colleagues, not only going into the field, but then in the processing, the debriefings, and the sending folks back out on sequential shifts that we were doing. Natural disasters, I frame them in relation to, or in contrast to, maybe human-caused disasters as it relates to faith. But it's important to understand that they're not any easier. I mean, because you can maybe attach a tsunami or a hurricane, you know, in some kind of narrative as God's will, does not mean it's easier to handle than a school shooting or a terrorist attack. And one of the big reasons for that is connected to natural disasters scope. And I promised a young girl, she was about 11 or 12 years old, that whenever I would talk about the tsunami responses that we were involved in, that I would show pictures of her ocean and her family's ocean and the village and the community that she's in. Their entire livelihood and spirituality is connected to the sea, to the ocean. And this dialectic of beauty and of peace that the ocean and prosperity that the ocean would bring them, with the fact that the ocean did this to them, that the tsunami had done so much damage and pain, was something that many people were trying to make sense of. And the pictures that she kind of guided me to take, she said, take a picture of our beautiful ocean. And it was, I mean, I don't think this image is doing it very good justice, but it was gorgeous. It was one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen, with the blues and the greens and the turquoises of the water. And very, very calm, very peaceful. And she said, turn around from the very same spot that I took this picture and take a picture of my village. And the scope of this devastation is I cannot explain it verbally. I mean, if you get into a car here in Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities, and you would drive to, I don't know, Kansas City, and every single foot of the trip looks like this, that there is absolutely nothing untouched, undamaged, or undestroyed. That is the difference between natural and human-caused disasters, because while a school shooting or a terrorist attack is horrible in its own right, it's generally pretty small in terms of the numbers of people that are hurt and the geographic areas that are covered. And in this example, I mean, we had more than 100,000 people that were killed, and every single place we went for miles and miles and miles and miles up and down the coast was destroyed. And every one of our team members got heat stroke at different points during the deployments. Most of us got sick at different points as it related to cuts and infections. It's the only time you'll ever see me in a beard, because we weren't allowed to shave. We were always trying to be very careful about this. And all of us were sleeping under tents with everybody else. I mean, the ability to, finish your shift and then go home or go 10 miles away to a hotel is not easy to do. And in a natural disaster type of response, sometimes it's impossible to do. These are examples of us collaborating with teams from different parts of the world, and our teams with the University of Minnesota, interdisciplinary, so are everybody else's teams. And part of the collaboration isn't just disciplines with each other, but it's teams collaborating with other teams, translating ultimately into a whole that's more than the sum of the parts as we purposefully and collaboratively align different resources to what we're up to. One of the, and I'm almost done with my pictures here, but one of the academic things that's coming is this concept of ambiguous loss. And that was coined by one of my mentors. Her name is Pauline Boss. She's a university professor emeritus now. She's retired, but she's just as busy as she ever was. The mismatch of somebody's psychological and physical presence is very difficult for people to make sense of and to cope with. And if you have somebody that's physically present but not psychologically with you, that would be an example of dementia or alcohol or drug addiction, where the person that is, I mean, you're looking at them, they're right there, but they're not really there, and that can be horribly difficult. And the flip side, and this is where trauma work oftentimes overlaps with ambiguous loss, is where somebody is psychologically present, but physically not present. And this is another human universal, that it doesn't matter what your, and there's not very many times we can say that, but it doesn't matter what your religion or your ethnicity or your part of the world you're connected to. A human universal is that we need to have some kind of confirmation of death in order to say goodbye. We need to have a body to have a funeral. And when somebody is there one day and then the next day they're not, we get into this place of frozen grief where we don't really know if somebody's dead or if somebody's alive. And families will just melt down over this when different members, after so much time, are starting to believe that the person is dead, and others are still holding out hope. One of the things that we did with the tsunamis was every time there was low tide, we would walk up and down the beach with people looking for things that the ocean had given back. And when we would find mom's dress or dad's shoe, childhood toys, different objects or musical instruments, things like this that folks could connect with somebody that was missing, then there was this personal and collective narrative now that the ocean had answered their question, that yes, it had taken their father away, or that it had taken their child. And then the family or the community would have some kind of physical confirmation and literally have a funeral with a shoe, or a musical instrument, things like this, because we need to have something physical in order to do that. And there were a lot of different examples of what that looked like. Another example with tsunamis were in mass graves where thousands of people were buried pretty quickly in order to meet public health needs of those that were living. Members of those teams took Polaroid pictures of bodies before they would be buried, and then we would look through pictures of the dead with family members. And on one hand, they would be hoping so much to not find a picture of their little girl or of their parent, because that would mean that maybe there was hope that they were, alive somewhere up or down the coast. But on the other hand, they were kind of hoping that they would find a picture, because the ambiguity of not knowing was always so much harder than a tangible truth of knowing that indeed someone had passed away. I'm conscious of time, so I'll go through some of these last pictures quickly. These were pictures of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and the issue of ambiguous loss was coming here in a different way than we had seen it before, where people that we had said goodbye to were now missing. So people's, their mother, for example, had passed away 10 years ago, and every year on her birthday or at Christmas time, you would go and visit, mom's grave, and you'd tell her, what was going on with the family or the children, or that you love her and you miss her, you're still thinking about her, and maybe go in there on non-routine times if you're really having a hard time. And now she's missing, and the biochemistry of graves and coffins breaking open, and this was happening pretty commonly here because of the way the water table was already very close to the surface. Once the coffins broke up, the bodies, when they would be exposed to the elements and to the water, would basically disintegrate, and nobody that was lost in this manner was ever found. And there were countless folks that were experiencing a second loss now of somebody, and then having to figure out together, questions like, do you have another funeral? If you do, how do you do that? You don't have a body to bury. And what types of meaning or narrative do you connect with, maybe heirlooms or things that you associate with that person that you could maybe have a funeral with. These are complex things, and these are things that couples and families were having to wrestle with without any kind of clear example or rule book to follow. So and I've touched on some of these things as we go forward here, but in an academic sense, the most common clinical challenges that we are going to experience, and if you go into literature, you can see there's plenty of empirical support for this. And on the other hand, I don't know if you need to go into the literature to get a sense of the most common things that you're going to be hearing once you've done a couple of deployments, because the struggle with making meaning, again, why did this happen, is oftentimes the first place that any of us go when we're struggling with something. We don't have to be in the context of a tsunami or a terrorist attack to ask these types of questions. We hear this all the time. Patients that are struggling with depression. Patients that are struggling, with phobias, or couples that are on the brink of divorce. They're always asking, why do I feel this way? Why am I so sad? Why am I so fearful of this? Why can't we figure out how to make this work? Why can't we communicate without escalating into a screaming match? Where is this coming from? And it's a very normal human response to try to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. And we get into a mismatch as it relates to the mental health disciplines and sitting with people as they struggle with this, and that is that understanding why something happened sometimes can require a fair amount of time and a fair amount of clinical discussions about where we've been and what's happened to us and what could have happened that didn't, and how that was hard or whatever, and we eventually come to some kind of insight or personal understanding or narrative on why we're depressed, and maybe we connect that back to family or relationship experiences leading up to the present, or maybe we gain insight on why we can't get along as a couple because of our different backgrounds and how problems got solved or something like that. You do not have the luxury in the context of trauma work to do that kind of insight-oriented pursuit. In trauma work, you might have one sitting with somebody. You might have 3 hours with them and never see them again. You might sit with them for 10 hours and never see them again. You don't know. And to honor this human want for something that oftentimes takes a long time to achieve in the context of not having predictable or very much time with people is a real struggle. And I think that in our experiences, and certainly in mine, sitting with people as they struggle with this question is a reminder to me of, and I smile here. I mean, that my mom always told me, that God gave me 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And I think that so oftentimes in the helping professions, especially, we're socialized or trained to have answers and to listen just enough before we start talking. A lot of research with the medical field has shown, for example, that the average physician interrupts their patient within like 20 seconds of walking in the door. We're just not such good listeners. And I have a lot of different stories where I think people have been able to create meaning based off of nothing that I did, but more about the fact that we as providers didn't get in the way. And I think that one of the most powerful for me happened back in that very first deployment that I did. And I'll never forget her. There's this young girl. She was about 8 or 9 years old. And I'll call her Tiffany. And she lost her dad in the towers, and it wasn't fair. It wasn't fair because she adored this man, and there were so many other people that got out, and she loved her dad so much and could not make sense of how he wasn't one of the people that got out. And if you think then, okay, how do you help this young girl make meaning of this? I mean, is there anything that you learned at graduate school to say? No. Oh my gosh, no. And I remember we were in a family assistance center that the Green Cross had been coordinating, And she was just inconsolable. She was crying. She was so sad. And none of us again knew what to say. And it was so powerful because there was another man there, and he was actually a friend of Tiffany's dad, and he was a family friend. And Tiffany knew him. Tiffany's mom was there, and she was, she didn't know what to say, and she was, of course, dealing with her own loss of her husband. And nobody had noticed the family friend, and he scooted his chair up, and it squeaked on the floor, and all of a sudden we noticed him. And and he's leaning in and he's talking to Tiffany, and he's like, Tiffany, listen, your dad had to be there. He had to be there because he loved people and because they loved him back. And that didn't make any sense to Tiffany. It didn't even compute. And she was so angry and crying. And he's like, Tiff, no, listen, I have to understand. And some of the backstory here was that the friend of Tiffany's dad had immigrated over to the United States, like 10 or 15 years before with him. And he's like, Tiffany, your dad was always the raging extrovert. He was the one that got us, these jobs here in the towers. And we went to English classes together at night. And I don't think I would have had a chance without him. He's my best friend, And when we got these jobs here in the towers, we always struggled to get any work done. They were maintenance workers, janitors in the towers, because he was always stopping and talking to people. And when he met your mom and they were dating, and then, God, when they got married and she was pregnant with you, everybody was constantly getting these updates, on how your mom was sick or that she felt you kick for the first time. And then after you got born, we didn't get any work done, because your dad was always showing pictures to people, and it didn't matter if it was another maintenance worker or some rich CEO at the top of the building. Everybody knew your dad. Everybody loved him, and he asked them about their lives, and they loved to talk about their lives, and they could tell that he cared about it, and they all cared about him. And it still did not compute to Tiffany why she had to lose her dad on the towers. But then it made sense because, and again, the whole world is gone. It's just the two of them talking, and we're just kind of watching this. And he's like, Tiff, your dad and I have worked in the towers for all of these years, and he knew every single hallway, he knew every single elevator, he knew every single staircase, and he knew every single door. And he knew which doors were locked, and he knew which doors were unlocked. He knew which ways we're going to get people out, and he knew which ways we're going to keep people stuck. And he ran in and out of those towers, Tiff, dozens and dozens of times, getting people out because they knew him, and they trusted him, they loved him, and he loved them back, Tiff. And you know what? By the time the towers came down, I bet you he got more than 1,000 people out. 1,000 people, Tiffany, 1,000 moms and dads and grandparents and kids that would have been stuck if he hadn't been there. That was why he needed to be there. And go back to the pheromones. You could almost feel Tiffany like starting to take this corner psychologically as something that didn't make sense, and certainly wasn't connected to any of the talking heads on the radio that was, or on the TV that were saying, this happened because of this, that, or the other political thing. That's not going to matter to Tiffany. But you could feel her start to make sense of something that didn't make sense, that she was starting to make meaning about something that really she needed to do before she could do anything else. And and he could have stopped there. It was, I was crying. I remember, everybody was crying, and then he's like, Tiff, have you ever been to a ball game? You ever been to like a sporting, kind of, and we're sitting there going, oh my God, why are you asking her about sports? This was so amazing what you were just talking about. And Tiffany's shaking her head, and she, no. And then he lifts his head up and he looks over at Tiff's mom, who's crying with all of us, and he says, hey, when some of this stuff settles down someday, could you take Tiffany to like a ball game? And of course Tiffany's mom's shaking her head yes or nodding her head yes. And then he turns back around to Tiff and the whole world's gone again and it's just the two of them and he's like, Tiff, your mom, she's going to take you to a ball game, okay? And when she does, I want you to look out into the stands and think about what 1,000 people looks like. And then you'll know. And I remember at the 10-year anniversary event, there were a number of things that were happening in New York and with the 32BJ organization that Tiff's dad had been connected to. Pauline Boss was there, and so was Tiffany. And it's just amazing to see what she continues to do today. She's connected to different groups that are organized and rally and support kids that lost their parents in 9/11. And everybody's kind of looking at her behind her back, talking about her. She doesn't know it. She's running around just being the amazing person that she is, thinking about how very much alike she is to her dad and how his spirit and his energy and his love for people continues in her. And I don't know if she would articulate it this way, but I think that as she was able to begin to make meaning, she was able to begin healing. Now, I don't think she or anybody that's gone through something like this has ever done. I don't think that closure per se is and there's actually a lot of research now that shows that closure, as we think about it in a traditional sense, is kind of a myth, because we're always healing. We're always going to be different. But she's an amazing young woman, and I think that part of that growth began there in that room as she was talking to her dad's friend. I talked about ambiguous loss. I think that the increased appreciation for loved ones, survival guilt, and life review are close second or thirds in terms of the types of responses that we're going to see to folks that are healing or trying to in the context of disaster. The survival guilt, we hear it a lot of different ways, that there's this sense of injustice to someone who we've lost and some kind of unfair benefit that we have that we didn't deserve. Different examples seem to be like, it was my turn, no, it was her turn for, a cigarette break, for example, and I really needed my cigarettes. And I knew she was a softie, so I singled her out and I said, can we switch cigarette breaks, And she said yes, so I went out on her cigarette break, and hers was going to be in another 20 minutes because that was really mine. And I went out, and then an airplane flew in the building, and now she's dead. And she should have been on break. It should have been me that was there. I remember a teenager that I talked to that said, what, the very last memory I'm ever going to have about my mom ever was me being like a complete jerk to her at breakfast because she wouldn't let me have the car. And I stormed out of the house off to school, just ignored her when she was trying to say goodbye. And forever, like the rest of my life, that's the last memory I'm ever going to have about Mom. And it's just amazing to me how we treat the people that we love and that mean the most to us, oftentimes the worst. That we'll be so nice to the person at Target or, somebody that's checking out that has less stuff in their arms than we do. But then we come home to our spouse and we bite their heads off. And I think that this life review, and this is another big thing that we see in response to trauma, for a lot of people can be something that they learn too late, and for a lot of other people that they learn, and a blessing and a tragedy in some ways, because they learn it off of other people's not having learned it soon enough. And an example of that, where we really start to think about what's important in our life, go back to the intimate relationships class that I teach here at the U. My students, as they wrestle with different relationship phenomenon, and certainly trauma is all about relationship phenomenon. They ask me, they're like, Dr. Ty, why is it that in the beginning part of our relationships we feel like this spark and this energy, and then like 6 months later it's kind of we've lost the spark, and then as we start to unpack that, they start to understand that in early relationships, we pay attention. We're honoring the relationship with a lot of time and energy, and then later on we kind of get into our routines and we don't know what we're going to do on a Friday night, but we kind of presume that we are going to get together or do something, and we get into these dances that a lot of couples will do, like I don't know, honey, what movie do you want to see? Oh, I don't care, honey, whatever you want to see. And then we wonder why there's no spark. I mean, it's kind of our own fault. And I remember as we were talking about that, I'm like, well, what about I love you? And they go, what do you mean? And they're like, oh my gosh, I bet I do know what you mean. Like early on, we just like screaming it from the rooftops. And then later on, like the only time we say I love you is when, we're, writing it in the birthday card or when we're hanging up the phone, because it's like a routine or kind of expected then. Really doesn't mean anything then, does it? I'm like, I don't think it does, and as students were wrestling with this, and I remember several semesters ago, I had this idea. I said, okay, how many of you guys are going home for Thanksgiving? It was fall semester, undergrad class, most of them are. They raised their hand and they said, okay, if you feel it, because I have to respect that some of you might not, go home and in a time that it's not routine. So nobody do this when you're saying goodbye at the airport, But when they're going to hear it, I want you to tell your parents that you love them, and then if you're comfortable, let's come back and we'll talk about what that's like, And the reactions were just amazing and so varied. I mean, some people just couldn't do it. Other people had no problem. Some people could tell one, but they couldn't tell the other. They finally get up the courage. I love you. Oh my God, are you pregnant? Or oh, sweetheart, you hurt the car, didn't you? This presumption that if you tell somebody that you love them, that you're buttering them up for some kind of bad punchline, is so sad, and I think just even having kind of the awareness of that helps us to do it different. But I'll never forget, there was this student that we had. He was a big kid. He was involved in a lot of different sports, and he had been kicked off his dad's lap when he was like 3 years old because that wasn't masculine, and their version of I love you was good job, son, slap on the back, because I'm a man, certainly not going to show emotion, make fire, cook meat, kind of mentality. And he went home and he told his mom that he loved her right away. That was no problem, but he couldn't tell his dad, and he spent the whole vacation, Thanksgiving vacation, like 3 or 4 days that he was home, trying to get up the courage, and he couldn't do it. And finally, on the last day, he was getting mad at me because I had said you couldn't do it when you're saying goodbye at the airport or leaving, because that really doesn't mean much. It's kind of a routine time to communicate love. And he said he felt like it was like the middle of summer when you can't get a good parking spot, and so you're walking all the way across the parking lot before you get into Target, and you're just all kind of sweaty. And he said he had butterflies in his stomach and his hands were shaking, and he just, he felt like he was just losing his mind. And his dad's just hanging out in the other room, like reading a magazine or something like that. And he finally just sucks it up. Literally, he takes this big breath and he goes into the room. And his dad, again, just sitting there, and he's like, Dad, I love you. I think that you are this. You're just an amazing man. And and that was as far as he got. He couldn't talk. And his dad, who is also this big burly guy, just looked at him for like a moment, and all of a sudden this tear started to come down his cheek, and he's like, oh my God, I love you too, son. I love you with all of my heart. And all of a sudden these two big macho guys, they're crying and they're hugging each other. Mom's walking by going, oh my God, what's going on? And I think that one of the contributions that the trauma field has done, is evident in what happened with this young man and his dad, and that is that all growth involves risk. And you can stay safe and not say that you love somebody because it hurts if they don't say it back, or or if they say something lame like ditto, or I remember that didn't even work in the old movie Ghost. It made her mad, But you can also maybe not try out for that internship because it would really suck if you got rejected, or not ask somebody out because it would hurt if they said no. not apply for that job that you think is a long shot because it's just it'd be one more time of not getting something that you really wanted. And you can stay safe. You could certainly not do any of those things, but you're never ever going to grow. And connecting survival, guilt, and life review, I mean, this presumption that we have forever is not a good presumption, because anybody, right now, I mean, if you're listening to me talk right now, I mean, you don't know. Right now, you could be losing somebody that you love. You don't know. I mean, heart attack, car accident, terrorist attack, hell, a lightning strike. I mean, you don't know. And if you're thinking of the people that mean the most to you, and you're thinking, would I have any regrets if I never got to see them or talk to them again, then I think you have some work to do. And I think that, again, some of that wisdom that's come out of the trauma field has really done a lot of good for a lot of our other fields to encourage people to take those kind of risks without having it be in response to some kind of disaster first. As we move forward here, and we're almost done, I think that scope of practice is a big deal that we see and that we wrestle with, and as it relates to trauma work. In everyday practice, the disciplinary divides of what a physician does, for example, or what a psychologist does, for example, are very clear. There's questions about it in our licensure exams, that the mental health person probably shouldn't do some kind of physical intervention, for example. But the reality is that in the context of trauma work, there's a lot more overlap with the work that we do in comparison to the way that we would do it in our day jobs. You're not practicing under your license. You're not billing insurance companies or people to come see you like you would in your day job. This is not private practice in motion. This is trauma response work. And the overlap of what we do is a lot more evident because of that. Yes, mental health people do physical health stuff sometimes. Okay, that yes, physical health people do mental health stuff sometimes. If there's a specialized skill set, absolutely we're going to try to line that up. I'm not going to have, in any of the teams that I direct, I'm not going to have one of my mental health people try to fix a broken bone. Of course not. If somebody bolts because they're suicidal, I'm not going to send one of my physicians to go chase them, literally. But most of the time, we can overlap more than our everyday disciplines let us. And if or as we maintain that flexibility in trauma teams, and there's 1,000 examples of what that looks like, we end up doing much better work. As it relates to sibling disciplines, a lot of times people worry about this, and anybody back into our day jobs can understand why. That a psychologist, for example, and a marriage and family therapist and a social worker can all collaborate real well with a physician, but sometimes not so well with each other, which is confusing for the physician because they just see us all as mental health people. They don't understand, or most of the time even care, what the difference is between a psychologist and a family therapist or a social worker is. The reality in trauma response, though, is that oftentimes, because it's such an acute type of, acute after acute after acute type of presentation, and then a purposeful leaning on each other for each other's respective wisdom and expertise that also overlaps, is that we as sibling disciplines learn to value the richness of collaborating with each other more than kind of the disciplinary discipleship that maybe graduate school taught us. Oftentimes folks that don't do trauma work will graduate and they will tell you 10 reasons why their discipline is better than the other sibling disciplines. When we go into trauma work, we don't hear that type of narrative. And we always deploy, or in our subsystems of 2, and we always try to purposefully have different disciplines in those 2. So I'll put a psychologist with a social worker, for example, before I'll put 2 psychologists together, because they do better work. They do way better work when we start to connect with and really embrace the richness of the diversity that we have among us. Interpersonal boundaries, going back to those license tests, those are pretty clear in our day jobs that we try to avoid dual relationships if we can, that we're certainly not going to be sleeping in the same rooms, between professors and students, or sharing locker rooms, or having a supervisor, melt down and cry and then get support from students. It's always the students that are struggling that the supervisor is supporting. In the context of trauma work, a lot of that, it looks different. I mean, when the whole team goes out and you go into an area and the only place that all of you can sleep that night is here, in this room, or that the only place that all of you can bathe or attend to personal hygiene is in this locker room, or that the intensity of cases is such that your supervisor is going to cry because they don't know what to do with themselves. Those types of situations are very common, and we can't really prepare for them other than to be open to deal with them. And the frank and straightforward conversations that we do with each other is how we roll, and we build the ship as we sail it and dealing with it. So for example, in some of the deployments where we're all stuck in one room to sleep, we're running around figuring out different ways to divide up, the room, by gender or by the rank or role that different people are having. Figuring out times or shifts, with shared locker room facilities, things like this. And you just need to roll with it, and you need to be flexible with it and have it be very transparent, something that's on the front end of what we're talking about. The final super important and common thing that we deal with is, and you might have been wondering this as we're going forward here anyway, is how we keep our teams together. I mean, we see and we hear heartbreaking things, and to be clear, we also see and hear some of the most beautiful and inspiring things, but this is hard work, and it's easy to burn out in, and in a broader sense to break down in compassion fatigue. And burnout is oftentimes conceptualized as specific to work, where compassion fatigue can be a lot of things. It can be in your own, certainly, physiology and psychology, but also even just all the way up into your sense of spirituality and everything in between. Institutional or professional functioning is connected to the personal and the spiritual, and the biopsychosocial spiritual complexities of people is something where compassion fatigue can come up just about anywhere. And the importance of working to prepare it and to manage it if or as it happens is not just a simply warm and fuzzy, let's keep our folks together. I mean, it is in some regard, but ultimately, and we know this from our day jobs, is that when we are burning out or when we are experiencing compassion fatigue, we don't do very good work. And those of us in the helping professions are very aware of the mandates or the dictates to do no harm, and hopefully even better than that, do good, but we forget that we have an awful lot of power to hurt people. And when we are not taking care of the person that we are with 24 hours a day, we can put the people that we care for at significant risk. We don't deploy for longer than 2 weeks at a time, and even when we do deploy for up to 2 weeks at a time, nobody's allowed to work more than a few days at once. Even if we're on the other side of the world, nobody's allowed to keep working every day, and we will pull teams and we overlap sub-teams in ways that there's a constant baton passing and attention and time devoted to taking care of that vehicle. A lot of the wisdom that we talk to our patients in our everyday lives that frankly many people in healthcare don't do, that we're post-call living on caffeine and candy bars, burning the candle at both ends, talking to our patients about the importance of a balanced lifestyle and a good diet and date night. In the context of trauma, we have to practice what we're preaching, because oftentimes we as providers are running in our day jobs so close to burnout anyway that the intensity of trauma work will put us over the edge. And the time and the activities that we do is something that we do very transparently with each other in our buddy systems and in and across the hierarchy of incident command, alongside honoring the ethical responsibility that all of us in the helping professions, and it doesn't matter which one you're in, has some version of if you hurt, you need to seek help. And as a team leader and as a supervisor for this work, I'm always going to have so much more regard and respect for my team members when they let me know that they're struggling than if I have to figure it out for them. And there's this sense of embarrassment, or I don't want to admit that I'm weak, whatever. You're not weak. It means you're human. And I and everybody I know has had different points where they've needed to slow down, or they've needed to do different things to get themselves healthy again. What it means is that you're human, and I would rather you honor your humanness than burn yourself up and ultimately hurt somebody else in the process. And so I will say, you know, if or as anybody is interested to talk with me or to ask questions, that I'm happy to meet with you or to respond by email. My contact information is here. But in closing, I think that the work that we do in trauma teams is some of the most hard and challenging and horrible and exhausting and amazing and affirming and inspiring work that we do. And I am always, in every deployment that we do, reminded of that. And it is truly an honor and a privilege to be engaged in the work. So I appreciate you listening, and again, certainly invite you to connect with me if you'd like to know more.
Thank you, Ty, for a great presentation.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you.
So in closing, if you'd like to know any more about connecting with Ty's work or connecting to the University of Minnesota, please be sure to visit the websites listed here. And thank you for tuning in today.